Yeah, I got my little one going. It's recording a whole lot of nothing. All right. We're slowly working our way. Are we recording? Yeah. Huh? Okay. We're slowly working our way around the mandala. And we're trying to find aspects implicit in the mandala in its structure by looking at the geometric relationships between the cusps. And we've been saying that in the mandala, the first house is the cusp's cusp. It is the cusp that represents the moment. It's the right now point between the past and the future. If you take a progressive tour around the mandala, especially in the houses, each sector is a result of the sector which preceded it. For example, if you take the second house is preceded by the first. And so the Aries-like assertions of the first house or first house and sign produce the Taurus-like responsibilities that accrue to those kinds of assertions. In this, the 12th house represents the ripe past. And the first house represents new beginnings. So in a very epitomal way, the ascendant, or the first cusp, is the now point. It is where things are at the moment. Now, in a similar manner, the conjunction is the aspect's aspect. It represents the coming together of different planetary qualities in order to get something done. This is like looking at the geometric relationships between the planets as postures of activity. In fact, that's what they are called in some of the astrological systems of India. They're called yogas, which is an excellent term because it means bringing together, and at the same time it represents a posture of activity. The same thing was true in very early Western astrology, like at the time of Claudius Ptolemy, who wrote the Tetrabiblios, which was for many centuries the Bible on astrology. All of the aspects were called variations of the conjunction. So from this we can see that when the epitomes are congruent, that is when Mars is on the first house and that represents the conjunction, that we have all of the other aspects in some kind of a posture of activity relative to that. Now, this implies that in the cosmic mandala, the cosmos exists to get something done, to go through a process to gain experience. So being is an active thing as far as the mandala is concerned. There may be a non-active being, but for the most part, in cosmos, it is an active activity. So the aspects are the most important part because they indicate how things are done. Now, as we found when we looked at the static aspects and when we looked at the dynamic view of the aspects, we found that the conjunction and the opposition are special cases. In the mandalic view of things, they are also a special case because the conjunction is just the first house cusp, and that's like Mars conjoined to Mars. And it implies that the conjunction then is mandalically pure energy. What we saw 2 meetings ago is that the opposition is also a special case in that it is the only case where there is a second aspect, That is where the faster moving planet is giving to the slower moving planet. So that same opposition mandalically, where you're looking at Libra and Aries, that same relationship is the beginning of the second hemisphere. And the second hemisphere is the societal, the universal hemisphere, where the lower hemisphere, or the northern hemisphere as it is called on the mandala, is more personal. It's for personal activities. So when you have the opposition, you are switching from the personal sphere to the universal sphere. And in the personal sphere, all of the mandalic aspects are first aspects. And apart from the opposition, all of the aspects in the southern hemisphere, the upper part of the mandala, are also second aspects. But in that case, Mars is receiving from all of the big planets rather than giving as it was in the first half. So this is sort of like viewing things from the viewpoint of Mars. It is like switching from giving orders to taking and carrying out orders. And that in that switch is where that awkward opposition with Mars and Venus is. In terms of Mars, Venus always gives them orders anyway. That's the way things are in the battle of the genders. All right. We saw this very clearly last time, that Mars carried out things for Pluto. Now tonight we're looking at the mandalic Mars trine Jupiter, from the ninth cusp to the first cusp. The ninth cusp is the beginning of the last one-third of the mandala. The first third of the mandala is for personal things. The first house is the person itself. The second house is personal belongings or personal possessions. The third house is either personal or proximal relations with others as equal. And the fourth house is the opportunities for solving personal problems. You have to clear things up before you start the next sector. The second sector begins with Leo and the fifth house, and the first house is a house of personal assertion, and the fifth house is a house of shared assertion. So the second third is a shared third of the horoscope. That's what children are. You don't have children all alone by yourself. It's a shared activity. Then the sixth house is shared responsibilities, where you have a work group, or you have an assembly line or something like that, or you have laborers, and so that is shared responsibilities. The seventh house is for sharing with others as teammates or as partners or spouses or something like that, where you're sharing with equals on a voluntary basis. And then again, the eighth house is the cleansing house. It's the house of solving problems that are shared by people in a family or in a small group or something like that. I have found over the years that social work caseworkers usually have very loaded eighth houses. And then we come to the last third of the mandala. And that is the 12th house, working backwards this time. The 12th house is for solving universal problems. Problems that you solve in a laboratory or in an atelier or in a prison or a mental institution or a monastery or somewhere in retreat. The big problems for all of society are solved there. The 11th house is again relationships with others as equals, but these are universal relationships, like friendships, and they have a utopian kind of quality that doesn't know any borders. Everybody is equal. And then we come to the ninth house, working backwards. The second house is personal responsibilities. The ninth house is societal responsibilities. The 10th house, I'm sorry. The 10th house is for universal social responsibilities. In fact, all of society is stratified, and there's a hierarchy of relationships, of responsibilities and duties in society. And that brings us to the ninth house, which is the beginning, and that is for universal assertions, where the first house was personal assertions and the fifth house were shared assertions. The ninth house is universal assertions. Universal assertions are philosophies. I believe that this is the way things are. Or religion. This is something that is an assertion for a large number or a whole society. Value systems are also things that apply to everyone in society. So we can see that each third begins with an assertion. And that is followed by a resultant responsibility, and that is then followed by a basic relationship with others as equals, and then that is followed by the solution of problems. The 4th, the 8th, and the 12th represent that. So in the mandala, as far as I can tell, this works easier. You can see it easier with the houses than you can see it with the signs, which usually is clearer because it's more down to earth. It does apply to some extent to the signs because all the houses of solving problems happen to be water sign houses, and water is the universal solvent and cleansing of everything. And equals relationships are impersonal, and they are like air. All right, now we want to look at the ruler of the cusp of the ninth house, Jupiter. And Jupiter is the planet of philosophy and values. And this applies to the establishment of philosophy where values are necessary in order to succeed in universals. Now, Jupiter is important before entering into any of the other activities of the final third of the mandala, because some of those are things that involve octave planets. Pluto is a little bit out of that, but Max Heindel, for example, is very important when he talks about the spiritual life. He says we have to be thoroughly imbued with the values and the goodness and the philosophical attitudes of Jupiter, like looking for the good, before you start applying yourself to the higher planets. Because if you don't do that and you are not strong in values and you do not have a good solid philosophy of life, it's easy to go astray with the octave planets. And there are legions of different types of perversions that can take place with the octave planets. The one that comes to mind first is like drugs, that unless you really have a higher desire and attitude about yourself and your body, you can easily start thinking, well, you can take heaven by storm. So we have to be good people, and we have to be philosophically solid people before we can become otherworldly people. We've all seen what happens to people who do not maintain their ethics when they enter into the ninth house. They become unscrupulous, and anything to get to the top and to be at the top of all.
You mean enter into the ninth?
Into the 10th house, I'm sorry. In the pictorial zodiac, Sagittarius is a centaur that is a bullman that is shooting for the stars. And that is a symbol from rising from a bestial state through a human state and aspiring to a divine state, to the divine light. But when you look at things that way, that's a bottom-up point of view. You start first as an animal, then you become a human, and then you become a divine being. It works equally well to take a top-down perspective. And if you take a top-down perspective, you can say that the divine light or the divine fire pulls up the lower parts of our being. And so that's what we get when we're looking at Jupiter, is someone who is the uplifter of other people, somebody who is very, very positive. And it purges those below it with a kind of divine spiritual fire. So when we look at the mandala and we see the Mars trine Jupiter, looking from the 9th cusp to the 1st cusp, we see activity that is fueled by aspiration. And it is someone who's energized, meaning to say that somebody is philosophically energized by something higher, and they bring that out into the world. And that takes many different forms. Now, we're about to look at horoscopes again, and we have to remind ourselves that we're only looking at very obvious examples of this aspect. We're not always looking at whole horoscope, and in some cases, we may not even look at the most important aspect, though I do endeavor to find horoscopes where the where the aspect in question is one of the strongest, if not the strongest aspect, and where it is the most highly significant. All right, let's start looking at where enthusiasm leads to adventure. William Blake was an enthusiastic man, but not the one we're looking for. This one will all sing together. Born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, greenest state in the land of the free. This is Davy Crockett. And this is a really obvious horoscope to work through. Very, very obvious. In the first place, we have Sagittarius rising. So Jupiter is automatically a very strong planet. And Jupiter forms trines with Mars and also Mercury. So you can see that it's a very strong Jupiterian influence. We know from history that he was very adventurous and he was very enthusiastic about life, but he's not so much known for the the Jupiter-Mercury things. In fact, he was a humorist. And it wasn't only exaggerative, though some of his humor was exaggerative, but he was pretty witty. The enthusiasm from the Jupiter-Mars is obvious, but the political skill that he had was not so obvious, it was not so appreciated. He had the courage to stand up to the president, who was Andrew Jackson, and to debate with him and do exceedingly well. But Andrew Jackson had to get into the had to give in to the public, not to the Davy Crockett, who probably had a better view of things. The issue that he and the president fought about most was the removal of the Indians in the eastern part of the United States to Oklahoma. And Andrew Jackson eventually did that, and Davy Crockett said that's not, what was it called, the March of Tears, when all of the poor Native Americans were killed in that whole business. Okay, Jupiter in his horoscope has other aspects. It sextiles Uranus, and Uranus also sextiles the Mars and Mercury. This shows him to be a discoverer, and he was somebody who was able to distinguish the positivity of something before other people did. Because Jupiter Mercury is often speculation, but speculation sometimes is just observing and seeing that something new that's coming into being can't help but to be a great success. And that's what he did a lot. He was a fairly wealthy man because of his enterprises. The problem he had was that Jupiter was also square to the Sun. And he did exaggerate. And Jupiter square Sun is an exaggeration that isn't always based in strength. It's very often overblowing things because there is some degree of self-doubt. So it's maybe a lot of his adventure wasn't just pure adventure, and it wasn't just for the love of discovery. Maybe he was trying to prove himself. Now, it's interesting that there is, we won't go into it, but there's a lovely grand trine between the Moon and Neptune and Saturn and Pluto. So this is no mean personality. Venus, on the other hand, is unaspected. And he did have 2 wives, and he had 3 children with each of the 2 wives. But that runs counter to my experience, because usually an unaspected Venus in a man's chart has difficult.
Before you take it,
Yeah.
I'm just curious, is there anything that indicates the sudden death?
Yeah. Uranus.
I mean, Uranus and the 8th
Yeah,
house,
yeah.
but it was basically by war or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't see anything that's...
No, you have to die. You have to die somewhere.
I mean, I didn't see anything that was kind of like fire, which is basically...
No, he was killed outright by Santa Anna. In the Alamo, he was killed.
Richard, are we taking both first and second sextile?
No, only the first.
Oh, only the first? I thought we were doing the second trine.
No, we're doing only the first.
Okay.
And
Nine and 1 though.
yeah, but from 9 to 1 is first. Mars is forward in the zodiac from Jupiter. That's the first trine. If it were between Jupiter and the Sun, that would be and the 5th house, that would be a second trine.
It's after the conjunction. So the first one is the sextile, the square, and then the first trine.
Elmenbacher was a very great astrologer. And one of the things he thought was, it's horrible to have an unaspected Mars. You may have a ton of talents, and you may have great sensitivity, but if you don't have anything to galvanize them into action, they come to naught. However, if Mars is too strong, it leads to something coarse, and it leads to an exuberance that can override some of the finer qualities. And this is someone who had that kind of experience. Mark might know this person, but I don't think anybody else would. This is Augusta Kattendorf, somebody who was at one time, like during the Depression years, was very famous in the United States. What is interesting in this horoscope is you have the Sun and Saturn in a artistic sign, and they trine the Pluto and Neptune. So there's a lot of gentle stuff in this horoscope. This is the Jupiter trine Mars that we're looking at for this. And you can see that there is a lot of gentility, but it was overridden by the Mars. This is a pretty strong Mars trine Pluto. She had plenty of refinement. Uranus is conjoined the ascendant, and that shows that she had a lot of creativity, and she had some indecision about it, probably because the sun is square to the moon, and that's a sign of indecision. But eventually, she was able to overcome the indecision and the overriding qualities of Mars trine Jupiter. The Scorpio is rising, and that's martial, but that's not enough to indicate her source of fame. Does anybody know what she was famous for? Any guesses on that? There are 7 planets in air signs. She was an aviator. She was a barnstormer and did very, very risky, daring things. And that's where the Mars-Jupiter comes in. She was a barnstormer for many years, and people thought, wow, that's great. And she was quite famous, but it's probably, since the Jupiter in the 7th house is there, it was more of a public rather than a fame kind of thing. That's what I usually find anyway. But it's interesting that the 2 strongest aspects are the trine and the square between sun and moon. And she sort of needed the trine to overcome the indecision, which she did, but it overcame everything else in her life until she got too old for flying. And when she got too old for flying, then all the confidence that she got from doing that kicked in, and she was no longer a coarse individual. And what happened was she became a painter, and she painted, and she was a professional artist until all the way till the end of life. She lived to be 94 years old or something like that. It was an interesting thing about about the way that worked. No, 90. I got it in the notes here. 96 years old. All right. Now, we've seen 2 horoscopes now where we see that Mars and Jupiter are an energizing aspect, the Mars trine Jupiter. When one is energizing, one has to be discriminate about what one is energizing, or there will be problems. And this is somebody that had all kinds of energizing, but was not discriminating and was not thoroughly enough Jupiterian, and he did get into all kinds of perversions. Jack London. Everybody knows who Jack London is. What I didn't know before doing this little biographical study is that his father was one of the most famous astrologers in San Francisco at the time that he was conceived. This is a complicated horoscope. In fact, it's too complicated for just a few minutes that we have for it. We see that Jupiter and Mars is very strong. And it's the second strongest aspect in the horoscope. The strongest is the opposition of Uranus and Venus. So we can see a positive enthusiasm, but that positive enthusiasm got him into all kinds of troubles and even entered into his art. The Jupiter itself is complicated because both planets sextile the sun, but they're not strong aspects, so that the real positivity doesn't come out. And Jupiter square Saturn, and it's opposite to Pluto. So the Jupiter's in a T-square at the same time that it's in that trine, so you can see that this is a pretty tough chart. And all the T-squares in fixed signs, and it has two really dark planets. The Saturn square Jupiter is like poor judgment. And he makes poor judgments, and then he sticks with him. And doesn't give up on him, stays with him again, and on and on and on. And on top of that, Mercury is square to Jupiter. And the Mercury square Jupiter, so it shows that, the mind is a sea from time to time. Sometimes he's somewhat dishonest, somewhat unpredictable, but certainly confused, and some of the confusing might be drugs. He loved adventure, and he was adventurous. And he wrote about adventure, but when he did, he was not careful about what adventures he wrote about and how he chose to write about them. This is an interesting thing. He made a bundle of money in his life, but he was always broke because he blew it all the time. The thing is that the Uranus opposite Venus skewed everything else in his life. Uranus opposite Venus is someone who is a romantic. And he took adventurous things and romanticized them so that they lost the reality. Now that's all right if you want to have livid books or something like that, but in your life you can't do that. And so what did happen was that he couldn't bear up under everything, and I think he died of a drug overdose or something like that. It's really interesting. There are two books about Ed Morel. And Ed Morel was a man that was the last of the California outlaws. What had happened was when the Union Pacific, California Pacific Railroad was given the right to build a railroad going from Sacramento going east, they were given so many acres on either side of the railroad. They were given the right-of-way, just like the northern Wisconsin, the lumber companies were given the land for doing the lumbering of it. And what happened is they, in turn, sold the land to people on either side of the railroad to settle. But they never gave the company deed. They never gave the people deeds. And then they resold the land to new people, and the new people had deeds, and they forced the people off of the land surrounding the railroad, and they forced them up into the hills. And they became the California outlaws. And the last of them, the 25th man, was Ed Morel, who was just a young kid. And about this time, the people who had the railroad, which was Leland Stanford and company, started propaganda. Huntington was another one, and I forget who the third person was, but they had the newspapers. And then they got everything up in arms, and they sent the FBI and the Pinkertons and such out to capture the California outlaws. And they captured Ed Morel, who was a very stubborn man, and he spent many years in solitary confinement. He was sent first to, I'm not remembering, Folsom. He was sent to Folsom Prison, and they put him in a room with powdered lime, which is absolutely cruel. And what happened is they tried to break his spirit. Then they couldn't break his spirit, and they put him in a double straitjacket for days at a time. And he describes how you have to urinate, and the urine gets under the double straitjacket, and your whole skin burns. And eventually he had an out-of-the-body experience while in a double straitjacket. And a man 2 cells down, it took them years to even, they could never see each other, they could never talk to each other, but by rapping against the stone walls of the jail, when there were no guards around, they developed a code. And they communicated with each other. And he told his story to, I forget what the other man's name was. It was Jake something or another. But he had an out-of-the-body experience, and he remembered past lives. And he told his story to Jack London. And Jack London called the novel Star Rover. But he just, you read Ed Morell's The 25th Man, and here's a sane man who was later a crusader for prison reform, because he predicted to the warden who was trying to break his spirit, he says, wardens are going to be changed and I'm going to be released, because he had seen it all when he was out of the body. And everything he saw came to be true. But if you want to see the difference between a level-headed man and somebody who makes a romantic fantasy of everything, you read Star Rover by Jack London, and you can see how he took information that was good information. He was even using ghost writers and things, writers and things like that.
Was he also maybe kind of a public womanizer then, or not?
I don't know. It is conceivable to me that Uranus opposite Venus, and with the moon in the mix, is that he may have been a latent or not so latent homosexual, and that he used the writing and the drugs and everything else as an escapism from it, because that was not at all accepted in those times. He died from an overdose of morphine. So, all right. All right, where are we in the notes now? All right, we've looked at Mars and Jupiter as an adventure aspect, and we've looked at it as a galvanizer, and sometimes it overdoes things. But it's also, Mars-Jupiter in its positivity can be a mainstay. The next horoscope that we have is somebody who is extremely sensitive, and it is somebody who is extremely handicapped. So much so that without the Mars-Jupiter, the person would have been overwhelmed in the sensitivity and the handicap. It's somebody who needed an urge or a push of positivity to get through life. Helen Keller. She was the deaf-blind Wonder Woman. And the sensitivity we see from all of the planets in Cancer. And she has the moon and Neptune sextile to each other. Neptune is square to Mars, so there's a lot of Neptunian qualities in the horoscope. Now this is a partial classic because one of the two planets is in the 9th house. It's Mars. So we can see that the enthusiasm was a religious enthusiasm. And she did not belong to any of the regular sects because she did have some degree of clairvoyance. And with her clairvoyance, the regular religions didn't appeal to her, but some of the things of Emanuel Swedenborg did. And so she called herself a Swedenborgian. And must be Julie, huh?
I'll take a cab. Come home and watch it right away.
Oh, you just missed Jack London. We're talking about Helen Keller being an enthusiastic Swedenborgian. She was so hungry for something spiritual that she settled for Swedenborg. Swedenborg is really not very sophisticated at all. Now this horoscope is a classic in another sense, in that both members of the Jupiter trine Mars are in educational houses. And she was an enthusiast and a publicist for education. She actually got a degree while being deaf-blind. So she needed the Mars-Jupiter as a mainstay, and she needed it as a motivation, and she was successful in all of that. The general feel of this horoscope, if you look at the 12th house, you have the same sign on the beginning and end of the 12th house, and the ascendant is that Scorpio, saying that there is some kind of hangover from the past life, some kind of destiny that's ripe from the past life. And we can see that she was probably a boisterous, enthusiastic person and probably overdid it, because that's where the Mars-Neptune comes in. It's a tendency to overdo it and to push things. Even psychological cruelty you could get from Mars and Neptune. And so she probably was something like a zealot or something like that in the past life, and probably overrode other people, but had enough strength to get her through the retributive lessons that brought her to where she will be in the future when she understands.
So if there's the same sign at the beginning and the end of the 12th house, right?
Yes, usually that's a sign that there's something, a direct carryover from the past. And again, every time I assemble the notes for one of these classes, I encounter a snag or something unexpected that should be expected, but I learn a big lesson every time, and tonight was no exception. The problem was an excess of one type of Mars trine Jupiter that I didn't want to really address. Mars and Jupiter are both planets of pride, and they always in trine indicate a positive, healthy pride. Both planets are planets that rule athletes. Jupiter is the sportsmanship of athletics, and the actual sweat of it is the Mars part of it. So one would expect with close orb trines of Mars and Jupiter a lot of athletes. And there was no disappointment in that. I was shocked. I didn't even do a statistical study on it. I didn't. It was so obvious that compared to any other web search that I've ever done for, I just turned out all kinds of professional and amateur, especially professional athletes with Mars trine Jupiter. I can't I can't say that by statistics that this is so, but it seems very, very clear. So I didn't want to do any athletes' horoscopes. Eventually we'll have to do some of them, unless the person was something more than just an athlete. The very lovable person next is somebody that was more than just an athlete. This is
I don't know that per se.
this is the voice of your Milwaukee Brewers. This is Bob Uecker. He did play Major League Ball for about 7 or 8 years, but a lot of his career was in the minors. He was a so-so hitter. I think he had a lifetime batting average from the biographical things that I looked at of around 200, which is not really a great hitter. But he was a great defensive catcher. But in spite of the fact that he was a great defensive catcher, he held the record and may still hold the record for having the most passed balls, which is when the ball gets past the catcher and goes to the backstop. And the reason for that was because he was the catcher of choice for Phil Niekro. And Phil Niekro was a knuckleball pitcher, and you never know where a knuckleball is going to go. It's a tricky thing. In fact, this year in the majors, almost won the Cy Young Award was R.A. Dickey for the New York Mets. And he is a knuckleballer. He may be the last of the knuckleballers because it takes many, many years to learn to become a knuckleballer. It's somebody where you throw the ball with your knuckles rather than putting your fingers around.
And when it is that the ball is not spinning, it's going like this.
Okay, okay, so you can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
Oh,
can-
yes.
Switches
Yeah.
the ball.
It
Yeah,
never,
it's-
never spins.
It's almost, in a small way, it's like throwing one of those little Nerf balls.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
something like that. And but, but after all of his experience, Bob Bucher quipped, "The best way to catch a knuckleball is to pick it up after it has stopped
Oh my
rolling."
God, that's awesome. That's awesome.
He's just a lovable comedian.
Oh, that's funny.
He used to be guest star in Johnny Carson a lot.
Okay.
And in fact, he
And so
was.
is he a Wisconsin? Yes.
Yes, he's from Milwaukee.
Bucher.
Yeah. He used to be on a comedy television show. And he started 2 screwball sports programs for television, both of which were successful. And he even had a small part in the Star Wars movies. So he's in the Baseball Hall of Fame, but for his work as the sportscaster for the Milwaukee Brewers. And when he was inducted, I heard a little bit of his induction speech, and he says, "Well, I really wanted to be in here for my work as a player," but he was very, very self-deprecating and humble. But what really makes him beloved, to me especially, is that he is in the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Because twice he was the host for WrestleMania and was nearly choked to death with the microphone cord.
Oh, God, you gotta love.
All right.
Wrestling, man.
The Mars trine Jupiter is between the 11th and the 3rd houses, and it trines Venus. And I suspect that he probably had a lot to do with the ladies, though none of that is mentioned. There's a lot of things that you go to biography sites, and unless you have a full book biography, a lot of the things don't come out. It's really sad. So he's a delightful, cheerful man. I'm not a huge baseball fan, but I do like listening to the Brewers because he starts telling stories and he starts chipping things in that are, you forget about the baseball game. Jupiter is in a T-square with Pluto and with Uranus. So Jupiter, it isn't all positive. I think it has something to do with so many of his things were both successes and failures at the same time. I suspect, since it focuses on the 8th and 2nd house being the empty part of the T-square, I suspect that he was not too successful in all of his business ventures, but I couldn't find anything about his financial life at all. Jupiter is also trine to the moon, which shows that the Jupiter-Mars is part of a grand trine. And it's an Aries sign grand trine, only he wasn't a pilot. He was somebody that you just could talk, he could communicate, he could get things across to people. I don't know, but I have some suspicion, I would guess, that the Jupiter opposite Uranus probably had something to do with the fact that he had to deal with those screwy knuckleballs, and that it was Uranus is unpredictable and the knuckleball is unpredictable. So I would.
Yeah. One other thing, though, is there anything that would indicate that there's almost a need for being the center of attention?
I don't know. Maybe maybe that would be a reflex from the Sun in Aquarius to the Sun to Leo. I don't know.
Comedy show was Mr. Belvedere.
Oh yes, Mr. Belvedere, yeah. And the 2 shows had about the same name, The Wacky World of Sports or something like that. Yeah, I think that's what it was. All right. Jupiter is a planet of size. Physically, it's the largest of all the planets, and it's large enough to almost be a star. Jupiter is the only planet in our solar system that emits light. And if it were just a little bit bigger, and maybe if it collects a few more comets or something like that, it will be big enough to become a star, and it would then be a binary star with the sun. It's always been associated with greatness. Inward greatness and outward greatness. The idealism is to be a big sport, is to be a good sport about anything that happens. And a big man is usually a forgiving man. And Jupiter is the planet that almost always forgives. Venus is pretty forgiving also, but it does have some of that not unforgiving quality with Taurus. So Jupiter people are said to be forgiving because they get to see a bigger picture of things. And that automatically produces idealism. Like looking at the stars at night, you get a bigger picture of things. It's very difficult to translate the big picture of things into actions because mundane human actions are trifling in comparison to a really big picture. The big picture can bolster one in pride so that you're willing to try it, but it doesn't always carry it off, and it doesn't carry it off very well. And for this reason, it's difficult to find examples of people carrying the spirit of a big picture into representative action. The next horoscope is one that was successful in doing that. Quite amazingly successful. This is the horoscope of Cosima Liszt. Cosima Liszt was the daughter of the pianist-composer Franz Liszt, and she was the second wife to Richard Wagner. In fact, if you look her up on Wikipedia, you look under Cosima Wagner and not under Liszt. Franz Liszt was Wagner's closest friend. And I don't know how to say it, but it's not a thing that you marry your closest friend's daughter. How it all came about, it's not a simple matter at all. The lives of the artists, especially of Wagner and Liszt, were filled with all kinds of intrigue and scandal and many seductions and things like that. And at the time, there was a banker who heard Wagner's music, and he quit being a banker and dedicated his life to music, and he became a conductor. And as a conductor, he specialized in only conducting Wagner music, and so he became familiar with Wagner. But he married Cosima Liszt first, and one time he came to visit Wagner with his new wife, and she had a moment. She didn't say anything, and a year or so later, they came to visit Wagner again, and what happened is she threw herself at his feet, and she kissed him all over his whole body and everything, because she had a falling in love moment, an extreme falling in love moment. I don't know what to say beyond that. And then they carried on an open affair, and they got married. She divorced her husband and got married, and he was in a spot because he never talked to Wagner again, and since he was a specialist in only conducting Wagner music, and he wasn't going to conduct any Wagner music. I don't know if he went back to banking or what, but it was all difficult. All right. What happened is that she married Wagner, and she was at least 20 years younger than him, maybe even more. So she outlived him. And what happened? Pluto in the 8th house, she inherited a considerable fortune. And part of that fortune was the theater and grounds at Bayreuth, which is where Wagner had this special opera house built. In fact, he even studied acoustics in order to get exactly the sound that he wanted in the opera house. And all of this was funded by Prince Ludwig, who was the patron of Wagner until he went broke. Richard Wagner is the only composer of operas that bankrupted the kingdom in putting on his operas. And so she was left with that. Now, most women probably would have thrown up their hands and said, what can I do with this? And most women would have taken the money and ran. And they would have a pleasant life, but not her. She had the Jupiter, trine Mars, pride. And she was dedicated, was her attraction to Wagner. She was dedicated to his big ideas. And, or most of which were big. But so she threw herself into continuing to stage the operas. And she did a very excellent job. This is an accurate horoscope. She's described as being tall, with Jupiter in the 1st house. She was a big woman. And she had a large mouth, which often happens with Jupiter in the 1st house. Jupiter is trine not only to Mars, but it's trine to Mercury. And the combination is what made it all possible. Jupiter rules the higher mind, and Mercury rules the lower mind. And when you have a trine between Jupiter and Mercury, you have someone who can see the general principle or the big idea of things and know which details express it, or to take what detail to get to a universal idea. So all of this is in earth signs, which shows that she's very, very practical. And so what she did is she not only continued the festival, she improved it. And because she loved him, she was true to the big spiritedness of it. Wagner used to lose sleep at night because he wondered whether a dragon's head was big enough to really terrify the audience. And it was, yeah. And she was true to that. And she pulled it all off. And she was, it was obviously production. She had the personality, the bigness of personality that she could bring it into being a production. Oh, look at that. And she was quite successful. Unfortunately, she inherited more from Wagner than just the money. Pluto is square to Mercury and Mars, and Wagner had ideas that were close to, if not actually, anti-Semitic. And she continued with a lot of those ideas. In fact, during the time, it's 20-some years that she ran the Wagner Festival at Bayreuth, that it became known as a place of anti-Semitism. I've always wanted to go to Bayreuth.
Question.
Yes.
The Jupiter Mercury, since that's the first.
Yeah, it's a strong. Yeah.
Does it act the same way with the second trine or not?
I think that in the first trine it goes from universals to particulars, and from the second trine it goes from particulars to universals, more likely. Because Jupiter is the giving planet in the first trine, and in the second trine Jupiter is receiving from Mercury. I haven't done a whole bunch of horoscopes to check that out, but that's a good thing that would be worth taking the time someday to check that out.
I feel like there was a movie
Probably was.
about this whole scenario
Yeah.
that I watched.
Yeah.
You haven't seen it.
No.
You don't watch many movies anymore.
No, I don't watch many movies at all, although I do have the whole ring cycle and I have Parsifal, but I do
The
not...
whole which cycle?
Ring cycle. The Ring of the Nibelungen was his 4 operas over 13 hours, and they're fabulous. They stretch across, they stretch from Atlantis across the Aryan epoch and into the dawn of the New Age. Oh, they're beautiful, very beautiful.
Really?
Yes.
I don't know much about opera.
If you're going to get involved with opera, his is a good one.
Okay.
Well, doing astrology classes has a function similar to what prayer does in my life. They're both therapeutic. There have been a number of occasions that I have been asked to pray for people. And I've been asked to pray for people that I didn't like. And if a prayer is to be successful, it has to be in earnest. And it has to be the real thing. And what has happened is I have found that in praying for people that I didn't like, I learned to love them. Because you fight with yourself in a prayer in order to do it, the right way. And the same thing is true with horoscopes. I've had to work with horoscopes of people that I didn't like, and in working with their horoscopes, I get to at least tolerate them, and if not appreciate them. And this is one of the people that I've often had a difficult time with. This is the G-Man, Gordon Liddy. G. Gordon Liddy. This is a difficult horoscope to talk about in a few minutes. This is the last horoscope we got, but I don't want to spend a long time on it, and it's difficult in the short term. It's very complicated. The sun is square to Neptune, and it's a strong square, which shows self-confusion. But at the same time, the sun is trine to the moon, which shows clear knowledge of self, the ability to reflect. It's coming, it's the second trine, and it's coming from the 9th house. You can reflect and get a very good concept. The trines, the Jupiter, Mars, and the Sun, Moon, are all from the 9th house to the 1st house, which is exceedingly open. But then you look here, you've got Saturn opposite Pluto, which is exceedingly closed and very, very secretive. And even the Neptune Sun tends to be secretive, whether it wants to be or not. So we can see that this is a man of many contradictions. Many contradictions. Some ways open, some ways closed, some ways clear, some ways confused, some ways in the dark. It's clear from the trines that he's positive that he believes in all of the philosophies, especially the political philosophies that he has coming from the 9th house. And he identifies with them because the sun is there, and he considers himself a personal embodiment because of the sun being in the 1st house. They in fact probably do have some truth to them, but they're not, It was so much so that he spent much, much longer in prison than any of the other Watergate conspirators, because he wouldn't plea bargain, because he believed what he did was right. And he believed that his patriotism was above the law. And this is where the darkness comes in from the patriotism. And, it's a really complicated chart to understand. It's I'm sorry, Guy. It's a Mandalic classic in that it goes from Jupiter in the 9th to Mars in the 1st. And it indicates a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of positivity. Now the thing about this chart is there's a lot of fear in it. Because Saturn opposite Pluto is very dark and fearful, and the Sun square Neptune is fearful. And the Neptune represents mother figures. But in his case, it was his grandmother, as the grandmother figure, who used to beat him a lot. And he used to be what we, when we were kids, were called fraidy cats. He was afraid of anything and everything. And then as he came into adolescence and young manhood, he decided that he was not going to be afraid anymore. And he was going to be very positive about himself, which is where the Jupiter-Mars comes in. And he was going to develop himself to have fear of nothing. And he did so, and he thought he did so by will. He got to be quite strong with things. The Mars in Sagittarius reflected opposite to Gemini, which rules the hands, and he was another one of those people like Van Gogh. In order to show that he had willpower and that he was afraid of nothing, he would put his hand in a candle until the flesh burned. So he claimed it was all will. In fact, his autobiography, he named will, but I'm not so sure it was. You know, like it was, will is you will to do something, or you will to do something else than what is presented to you. But will is not negative. And I think that to a large extent that the Saturn opposite Pluto, that a lot of what he calls will is just pure and, how would you say it, cultured ignorance. That he ignores certain pains and ignores understandings. All right, so that's basically all that I have for tonight. That's easy for me to say those things, speaking intellectually, but I'm not going to stick my hand in any candles, and I don't know if I have the willpower to do that or not.
Might it be, number one, insensitivity in general?
Yes, it can do that. It can ride roughshod over. Yeah.
And the other thing, when you talk about the sun, I don't know, a Neptune versus
Sun and moon.
the sun and moon,
Yeah.
knowing part and not knowing the other part could be also the thought that came to me right away. Whether or not it's true, I don't know. Not knowing a whole lot about spirit or spirituality, knowing a good deal about his physical capabilities in the material world.
Mm-hmm.
That's about it.
Yeah.
Planets and fire.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sun and fire.
Yeah. He has a skewed view of things. That's it. There's schedules around here. We now, the philosophy class will meet next week. And then everything is off until the first week in February. And the first Thursday in February, we start with this class, and we start with the Saturn square Mars. So hang on to your seats for that one.
We'll hang on to our seats for February since we're going to have to surround you with prayer and protection.
For Saturn square.
Every time I've seen Richard for the past month or so, he's proclaimed how dangerous February is going to be for him.
Yeah.
Oh,
And we all just like,
why?
like
Why?
it has nothing to do with it.
Saturn sits right on my moon on the same day that that Uranus is opposite my Mars. Saturn sits right on my sun. It's dead stop for about 3 days.